The Creative Nonfiction Podcast is sponsored by Goucher College's Master of Fine Arts in Nonfiction. The Goucher MFA is a 2-year, low-residency program. Online classes let you learn from anywhere, while on-campus residencies allow you to hone your craft with accomplished mentors who have Pulitzer Prizes and best-selling books to their names. The program boasts a nationwide network of students, faculty, and alumni, which has published 140 books and counting. You'll get opportunities to meet literary agents and learn the ins and outs of the publishing journey. Visit goucher.edu/nonfiction to start your journey now. Take your writing to the next level and go from hopeful to published in Goucher's MFA program for nonfiction. CNF is also brought to you by Bay Path University's MFA in Creative Nonfiction. Discover your story. Bay Path is the first and only university to offer a no-residency, fully accredited MFA focusing exclusively on creative nonfiction. Attend full or part-time? Part-time? Part-time. Part-time. From anywhere in the world. In the Bay Path MFA, you'll find small online classes and a dynamic and supportive community. You'll master the techniques of good writing from acclaimed authors and editors, learn about publishing and teaching through professional internships, and complete a master's thesis that will form the foundation for your memoir or collection of personal essays. Special elective courses include contemporary women's stories, travel and food writing, family histories, spiritual writing, and an optional week-long summer residency in Ireland, with guest writers including Andre Dubus III, Anne Hood, Mia Gallagher, and others. Start dates in late August and January at this point. Find out more at baypath.edu/MFA. All right. Wow, wasn't that cool that Aquaman came here and started the riff? You never know who's going to endorse the show. I have to use my pre-dawn voice since it is so early. The days are getting shorter. Life is fleeting. Hey CNFers, what's going on with you? This is CNF, the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, where I talk to badass writers, filmmakers, radio producers, and podcasters about the art and craft of telling true stories. Today's guest is Naomi Gordon-Loebl, but we'll get to her in a moment. You're going to want to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, so you get this in your feed without having to dig around for it, you know what I mean? It'll be right there waiting for you, like a loyal dog, waiting for you to come home from work. This podcast tail wags when it sees you. It does. That's a fact. So you doing all right? Working on that thing, finish that thing, start something else. You're getting overwhelmed by the sheer mass of crap you want to do, but can't stay focused long enough to do it. I hear you, man. Like I said before, Naomi Gordon-Loebl is here, and she wrote this great essay a few months ago for the New York Times about getting the yips while playing baseball. And we talk about what the yips are, if you don't know what the yips are. It ran in late March or so, and came across my Twitter feed, and it seemed really cool, and reached out to her, and I think we recorded this sometime in April. I'm running it now. I'm quickly burning through the interviews I got in the can over the last few months, and now it's getting close to the time to hit the panic button. Also, you should know that we had some connection issues while recording this interview, so halfway through this, the audio changes a bit. I'm sorry, these things happen. But here we are. I'm going to read to you a bit of Naomi's bio from her website, NaomiGordonLoebl.com. You ready? Naomi Gordon-Loebl is a writer, educator, and fellow at Type Media Center. Her work has been published in the New York Times, Harper's, The Nation, Complex, Hazlitt, The Washington Spectator, The Toast, the anthologies The Social Construction of Difference and Equality, and Emerge, and elsewhere. She is a recipient of residencies and fellowships from Lambda Literary, Monson Arts, and the Vermont Studio Center. Before working in journalism, she spent 5 years as a teacher and youth development professional, helping people who had left school to complete their high school equivalency diplomas. She was born, raised, and still lives in Brooklyn. Pretty slick, right? Follow her on Twitter at Naomi Gordon-Loebl. And keep the conversation going, man, at CNF Pod. You can also tag me at Brendan O'Mara, too, and I will jump in the fire. And stay right where you are. This is episode 158. Let's kick it with Naomi Gordon-Loebl.
I grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. I grew up in a pretty unconventional, I grew up in a communal house with my parents and my siblings, and then a few adults who were not blood relatives, but my parents were like radical lefties who had been living in sort of a collective house in Brooklyn. And when they had kids, they decided to see how it would work to stick it out there. And we stayed there for 12 years. So I grew up in a house with a bunch of folks that were not just my parents, but also these other adults who were kind of like aunts and uncles to me. So I had like a lot of people around me all the time, which was really, really a wonderful way to grow up. I grew up in downtown Brooklyn, like a couple blocks away from where Fortress of Solitude, Jonathan Letham's novel, takes place.
Wow.
It's actually like on the next block. And there's a lot of characters in that book who I remember and recognize from the neighborhood. He's about maybe 20 years older than me or so. But yeah, it was a pretty special place to grow up, I would say, in Brooklyn. And as a kid, what kind of a kid was I? First of all, I was obsessed with reading. Even though I did learn to read pretty late, actually. I think it's funny, like now I meet all my friends' kids and they're like reading and they're 3 years old. And I remember being in first grade and sitting with my teacher and her like literally struggling with the word the. So I learned to read late, but then once I started to read, I was very, very, very obsessed with reading. And I used to get in trouble for reading in class, like at times when we weren't supposed to be reading. Like I have this really specific memory of going to the bathroom with my book, like sneaking my book out of the classroom, like under my shirt. And then I'd look at my watch and be like, okay, how long can I stand in the bathroom stall and read before I like get in trouble and have to go back to class? I used to read under the table at dinner with my family. I was reading all the time. I really loved books, and they were a real escape for me because, I had a hard time in some ways as a kid. Like I was both queer and really nerdy, and both of those things together is like, now I can consider that those double blessings, but when I was a kid, they were definitely kind of double curses. And I was the kind of kid who I love to talk to teachers. I love to talk to adults in general. I still love to talk to people all the time. And, but it was hard. Like I like during recess, I just wanted to talk to teachers and grownups, and that doesn't make you very popular as a kid. So yeah, I had a conversation with my dad recently. I was asking him, I saw this guy with a toddler at a restaurant in Brooklyn and sitting like down to like a full meal, like appetizer, entree, everything. And I was like, man, like, how do you have a full meal with a toddler? Like, what do you even talk about? And I was asking my father about it, and he was like, Naomi, when you were a toddler, you wanted to carry on a 2-hour conversation. So I think I've always been, I love to talk. I love words. I'm really verbal. I love having conversation. It's probably always been true of me. So it's probably why I like to talk to people for my writing too.
That's great. And so what did your parents do?
My mom is a physical therapist. She works with kids now in the New York City school system. When I was a kid, she worked in a hospital. So she was like our in-house physical therapist, like for all of our soccer injuries and basketball injuries. My mom was always there. And my dad is an educator. When I was a kid, he was the teacher and director of an adult education program. So for adults who are learning to read and write. And it was like a really amazing community. My dad's students were really like at the center of his life in a lot of ways, and were always around. And I spent a lot of time like visiting him there and seeing just like kind of how transformative learning can be, and how like the process of learning to read and write and sort of like thinking critically about our world is really such a tool of empowerment. And it really influenced me, just like in really significant ways. My dad's students were like such powerful, strong people. They had so many stories, and yeah, they were just really engaged in these beautiful processes of self-actualization. Yeah, I mean, I could go on forever about education, and I won't, but seeing my dad's work as a kid definitely had a big influence on me. So yeah, and then he eventually went on to work with people coming out of prison doing similar adult education work.
Did you find? Well, let's see. I'll preface this by saying I just watched the Fred Rogers documentary, "Won't You Be My Neighbor?"
Oh, yeah,
and it's just brilliant, of course, and it made me wonder, like, especially with his two sons, because Fred Rogers gave so much of himself to a lot of other children. The documentary doesn't quite answer it, and I'd love to ask the director this, but I want to know if maybe he just by the nature of his work, he was giving the best of himself to these other kids, and it made me wonder what he was able to ration off for his own kids.
yeah.
And similarly, when you were talking about your dad and how invested he is and with all the adult students and that, I wonder, like, was he successfully able to ration his energy to give you what you needed at home, so you still felt special?
Oh yeah, definitely. I'm one of those people who's like insanely blessed in terms of my family and my parents, and I sort of think that being born to the parents that I have is maybe one of the luckiest things that's ever happened to me. And I realize probably most people are not so lucky. So yeah, no, my dad really, I think he gave a lot of himself to us at home, but really, like, seeing his work in the world was it set such a clear example for us, and such a model. It was such a model for me in terms of, like, the way I wanted to be in the world, the way I wanted to be with my work. My dad is a person with a lot of integrity. I think he really, something that anybody would tell you about him is that he's really lives his life in line with his principles and his politics. And so we really saw that. Like, he was always, like, kind of, and not because he was trying to model for us, like it wasn't this sort of self-conscious, like, I'm going to show you how to be in the world, but it's just like watching my dad be in the world taught me a lot about how I wanted to be in the world. This is a terrible story about me, but when I was a toddler, like, I think generally you asked what kind of kid I was. I was very, very, very headstrong, very stubborn, very opinionated, always wanted to do things myself. When I was little, my parents said that they had to leave a lot of extra time in the morning for me to leave the house because I wanted to tie my own shoes, even though I didn't know how. But I still insisted on doing it. So that's a little bit what I was like. So when I was, like, young enough to be in a car seat once, we were in the car, me, my father, and his student, who was a much older woman from the South, like a very kind of proper woman, elderly. For some reason, in the backseat of the car, I just started saying, penis, like, over and over again, like, constantly, just repeated, just shouting it. And, you can imagine this must have been, like, incredibly humiliating for my father, who's a really respectful person. But, part of his principles as a parent was, like, not about censoring us, not about shaming us for using certain words or language, not about giving the idea that it's inappropriate to talk about sex or to talk about bodies. And so he was just quiet. They just didn't talk about it. And I think that's a really good example of what I mean. Like, my dad, he wasn't going to like, act out of line with his principles in the moment in order to, like, save himself some discomfort. He was really, like, acting with integrity. And so I'm sure it was an uncomfortable moment for them, and I don't remember it, thankfully, but
that's hilarious. So when you learned to read, what were some of those books that were so arresting to you that you, like you said, you were able to just escape and really lean into?
Oh man, when I was a kid, that's an interesting question. What did I read when I was a kid? I loved the Hardy Boys. I read every single, like, Hardy Boys book that I could get my hands on. And of course, that's some gender crossing that was happening, or I shouldn't say that's some gender crossing. That was, I would have been expected, I think, by the sort of general culture to read Nancy Drew, because Nancy Drew was were the mysteries for girls, but I was totally uninterested in Nancy Drew or anything that was supposed to be for girls. I wanted everything that was supposed to be for boys. So I read the Hardy Boys, and you have to understand, like, growing up in New York in the 90s, the Hardy Boys is like basically like fantasy or like sci-fi. It's like so far from my reality. But that's what I liked about it. I read a lot of Agatha Christie. I like adored her.
Yeah, me too. I read a lot of that when I was growing up.
Yeah, I actually so my secret trick for long road trips is an Agatha Christie audiobook. It's like, I don't think anything, it actually makes you excited to get back in the car because you're like, I have to find out what happens. They're so fun to listen to in the car. I still do that. But yeah, so Agatha Christie, I read, again, when I was younger, some of the books that really affected me, I think, I read a lot of those kind of classic books that are now kind of considered young adult, even though they maybe weren't written that way. So like sort of coming of age novels like Catcher in the Rye. And I also really, when I was a kid, I was really into all those books that took place in places that were very far away from Brooklyn. So like My Side of the Mountain and Where the Red Fern Grows and all those kind of like YA, like books that take place in the country with like mountain boys, which is really funny because I none of that related to my life, but I guess that's why it was kind of escapist for me.
Yeah, it kind of just got you out of your own geography.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah. Well, especially because the truth is there really wasn't at that point, and this is something that has really shaped me as a writer. When I was a kid growing up, right up until like a young, like into high school, there really weren't books about, I never read any books about like 12-year-olds like me or 13-year-olds like me. There was also no TV about 12-year-olds or 13-year-olds like me. Like, I didn't see myself in any of the things that I read. So in a way, like, the Hardy Boys was very far from my existence, but so was anything else that was out there too. I had this idea when I was growing up that like something about me and my life was sort of like fundamentally weird because there were all these things about us. Like I was a girl, but I felt like a boy. I was a twin. I grew up in a collective house with a bunch of people who were not related to my family. My parents weren't married because they didn't believe in the institution of marriage. My family was vegetarian. Like there's all these things that like just seemed to separate, like just seemed different about us. And none of it, I never saw any of it like in the books that I read. I think that's really changing now. And that's really, really, really beautiful and cool to see. Like there's actually a ton of queer YA out there right now. It's like really exciting.
That's good.
But when I was a kid, there was no, like, I was never going to read books that had that like told stories that looked or sounded like my life. And it's, I mean, definitely affected me as a writer.
So you're a twin. Do you have a twin brother or twin sister?
I have a twin sister. We are fraternal. I think we look nothing alike, but every once in a while we'll meet someone who's like, "Are you identical?" And we're like, "Do you know what identical means?" Like, it literally means you have the same genes. I mean, we I don't think we look alike at all. But yeah, I have a twin sister. Yeah.
Very nice. And so you went to University of Michigan for college. You got your bachelor's there. So what drew you to Michigan, and what did you study, and what how did you start getting on the path that you're kind of on now in Ann Arbor?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So I have no idea how I ended up at University of Michigan. It's really funny. I really didn't know what I wanted out of college. I always think like, why are 18-year-olds? I mean, it makes sense that they're given the decision, but like, you're 18, you've never been to college before. How are you supposed to know what you want in college? But I knew that University of Michigan had a great creative writing program. I didn't quite connect the dots that's really mostly their master's program. And I really wanted to, I knew I was a writer. I knew I wanted to study creative writing, and you can major in creative writing as an undergrad there. And they also have one of the biggest LGBT archives, or like academic LGBT archives in the country. And I was really interested in studying queer stuff too. So that's kind of how I ended up there. I knew I wanted to be somewhere very different from New York, and I definitely got it. Moving to Michigan was an enormous culture shock. I had never been anywhere like that. I had never been anywhere. First of all, I did not grow up somewhere that was as white as Ann Arbor was. I had never been somewhere where fraternities and sororities were a real thing. Like, to me, fraternities and sororities were like, something kind of mythical out of like a TV show or a movie. Like, I had never been somewhere that you would actually, like, frat boy was sort of like I don't know, like a character to me. Frat boy was not like somebody you would meet.
Right.
And then all of a sudden I was on a campus where there were a lot of frat boys. People are sort of shocked when I say that I didn't know Michigan was known for football, but I truly didn't know Michigan was known for football. And so when I showed up there, and the first Saturday I was there, you couldn't find a single person on campus who wasn't wearing maize or blue. It was like so overwhelming for me. So yeah, it was really a pretty intense experience. And I was like pretty miserable there for a while, I think. But
did you just need time to kind of find your people and kind of get into a rhythm of your interests?
Yeah, I guess so. It was just such a different place to live than New York. Like, nothing was open. In New York, there's always something open. Like, restaurants are open late. There's always a corner store that's open until probably is open 24 hours. This just wasn't true in Ann Arbor. And I had been really radically politically involved when I was in high school. I was really involved in Riot Girl, which is like a feminist direct action kind of network group. So I was really involved in like queer feminist organizing. And I was also really involved in anti-war organizing in New York.
Mm-hmm.
So I came to Michigan with all these politics, and then I met people who had really different politics from me. I remember my freshman year, I got into this like enormous argument with my roommate about the police. And yeah, we were just on really different wavelengths. But I think what happened was, to some extent, the people around me, I found kind of folks that I connected with, and people went through their own political processes. And also, I came to Michigan with a pretty big chip on my shoulder as kind of like New York. I had a real like New York snob thing going on, I think,
Mm-hmm.
like a real like kind of East Coast chauvinism that was actually very problematic. And I think I like learned to appreciate the place that I was in. And I think it helped that I eventually realized that I wasn't going to be stuck there forever, and I could appreciate Ann Arbor and Michigan for like all the really beautiful things about it. And there are many really, really, really beautiful things about it. Michigan in the summer is one of the most beautiful places I've been. And I could appreciate it and know that I didn't have to be the right place for me to live forever. So yeah, I think I eventually came around. But yeah, I studied creative writing there. I took some really wonderful workshops with people like Peter Ho Davies. I took really wonderful classes with John Whittier Ferguson, who teaches James Joyce there. Keith Taylor, who's an incredible, incredible mentor and poet, gave me a lot of guidance while I was there. And I met really wonderful other writers in the creative writing sub-concentration there. And yeah, I wrote my thesis, which was a collection of short stories. And they were mostly about queer people in cities, which was who I became most interested in writing about. And yeah, that's kind of how my time there ended up. I think I really started to take myself seriously as a writer while I was actually, you know what, Brendan, that's not really true. I took myself seriously as a writer in high school too, but it was a significant and influential time for me, and I had a lot of time to write.
What did you find you were particularly skilled at in college that your mentor was able to sort of nurture you and kind of say, oh, like Naomi, this is what you're particularly good at. Really lean into this, and gave you that permission to keep going?
You know, the main thing is, before the sub-concentration at Michigan, before I majored in creative writing at Michigan, I had spent most of I was lucky that I had a lot of great creative writing instruction in high school too. I had really wonderful creative writing workshops in high school, and we read a lot, but a lot of what I had read up until that point was like books like Winesburg, Ohio. And basically, like, if you read only those books, then you pretty much assume that everybody who gets written about in short stories is white and middle class and straight and lives in the Midwest, in a small town. And it really affected me because I had really internalized the belief, even though intellectually I knew this didn't make any sense, that that's kind of what I thought you had to write. Like that was kind of that was the only model I had. And so I was writing stories about like middle-aged straight people in small towns, which of course they were terrible. They were terrible, terrible stories because what do I know about? I mean, not to say that we can't write about what we don't know, but I really had no emotional connection to that work. I just thought it was like what I was supposed to write. It was what I had a model for. And it was definitely like at Michigan, like Keith, I think really encouraged me to write about what did move me, and write about what I did care about, and write about the people who I cared about, and the people who I felt, the stories that I wanted to tell. And it was when I started to do that, like stopped feeling pressure to write the Winesburg, Ohio story and started feeling like it was okay to write the like queer Brooklyn story. I think that's when my writing was able to like move forward.
And as you were developing your voice as a writer, what did you feel like were some maybe false starts or things that you were struggling with early on as you were looking to kind of forge your own voice on the page?
Oh man. Well, there's a lot of bad work in my archive, Brendan. There's a lot of bad work there. I mean, definitely stock characters for sure, right? Yeah, I think like my work was probably laden with cliches and but yeah, again, I think still this same idea of like feeling like I had to write for a particular audience or I had to write within specific bounds. Like, oh, you can't write about this specific person with this specific identity without explaining it. Like, having to assuming that I would have to like, if I wanted to write about a genderqueer person, then I would have to explain what genderqueer meant. And of course that ruins your writing, or it can. And yeah, I think I did a lot of that kind of feeling tentative about writing about people who were not already very represented in the mainstream because I felt like they wouldn't be understood by an audience, and they would require a lot of explanation. And the more I let go of that, the more I just felt permission to just write the stories about the people I wanted to write about and trust that the audience would catch up, that the reader will catch up, or the reader will make a choice about whether or not they're interested. And that was kind of, I think that was sort of transformative and significant for me.
So after you graduate from University of Michigan, what's the next step for you?
My lifelong dream was always to teach teenagers and be a writer at night. So that's pretty much what I did. I got a job teaching at an alternative program in the Bronx called CUNY Prep that teaches teenagers who've dropped out of school, but it's a sort of a high school structure and a high school atmosphere. And I taught there for a couple of years, and then I taught at another adult education program for a couple of years, like my dad. And I was trying to write on the side, and I was writing a little bit, but it was very difficult. There's a certain kind of person who can have a full-time teaching job and also be a very prolific writer. I admire those people, and I'm not one of them. I just didn't have the capacity to do both at the level that I wanted to. And so eventually I left teaching and I ended up at The Nation magazine, where I started as an intern, and then I eventually became the research director there. So I was running their internship program and also running their fact-checking department. And that was a really, really, really amazing place to be in, to kind of learn so much about magazine journalism, about fact-checking, about accuracy and truth in reporting. So many different, there's a lot that I learned there. Yeah. And then after that, I got a fellowship, which I am now on at Type Media Center, which is a independent media center, a journalism nonprofit. And I'm a fellow there. And I do some creative nonfiction memoir work. And then I also do some reporting about queer politics and queer community.
Yeah, I recently read your story for The Nation up in Belfast, Maine, about the 28-year-old female
Oh yeah.
queer mayor up there, and that was a great story. And in a town of radical hippies, like when you said radical hippies, I wrote that down because it reminded me of the story I just read that you wrote. So I'm like, wow, there must have been a real connection there for you.
Yeah, Belfast is such an interesting place, and that story, unsurprisingly, has received some of the same heat that the mayor got or has been getting. I guess people are, there's a lot going on there. There's a lot of politics. There's a lot of friction and tension between kind of old guard and new guard, and people are really upset with her. And it definitely, I think, I got some pretty, real feedback from folks in the town who felt like I had parachuted in, which is a dreaded word you never want used to refer to you. Parachuted into the town and gotten one side of the story, and I really share that critique. I think people should. I think people should not parachute into places. People should not sort of write blindly about places that they really have no context for. And the piece is really supposed to be sort of a mini profile of her. It's really just supposed to be sort of, this is what it's like to sit down with this lefty mayor and kind of hear about her work, and this is what the experience of talking politics with her is like. It's really more of a vignette than it is a like reported piece on the town. But yeah, people were pretty upset about it, and that's okay. If you're doing any writing on the internet at all, you just have to be prepared for, I mean, you're never going to escape without some of that. It's pretty much impossible. I feel like you type one letter on the internet and like there's somebody who wants to tell you that you're an idiot and you like never had an intelligent thought in your life. So you just kind of have to contend with that.
What did that experience as the fact checker teach you about the kind of rigor you need to do, deeply reported pieces?
Oh man. I mean, so I ran the fact-checking department at The Nation for 4 years. So I was overseeing all fact-checking there, and I was supervising 6 fact-checkers. And it is a real education. I think every reporter probably could benefit from working as a fact-checker, because essentially, this is obvious, but we think about facts in one way as readers, and we maybe think about them slightly differently as reporters, but when you have to go through a story and take every single fact and independently sign off on saying, yes, I have independently verified that this is true, it's really a whole other level of understanding what it means to be accurate. I think in particular, you start to think about like the individual meanings of words and how like a tiny change in phrasing can really have a significant impact. The difference between one word and another is often the difference between something being true or not true, right or wrong. So I think it's made me be a lot more concerned with accuracy in my own writing for sure. And it makes you realize how much fact checking is like a whole other step of the process. There's writing the piece, and then there's also making sure that everything in it is really watertight. And that's a pretty exhaustive process. I think all of our writing would probably be better for being fact checked. And of course it isn't always. But yeah.
Yeah. That's kind of one of the unfortunate casualties of the journalism contraction the last 15 years or so. I feel like fact checking, I've only been fact checked rigorously once in the Creative Nonfiction magazine. It wasn't even that rigorous, but because it was more of an essay. But that's the only place I've really been fact checked, because every other place I've ever written doesn't have the capacity or the manpower to go line by line and verify every single thing. So it's kind of amazing that at The Nation that you had that kind of, I mean, it might probably felt like you were overwhelmed, but at least you had something in place.
No, it's wonderful. And I think you also realize when you're a writer and you get fact checked, even if it's a pain, you also realize what a service it is, that you're getting, that someone else is taking the time to go through your piece and make sure that everything in it is true. I mean, fact checkers are protecting writers. They are the last line of defense for writers. They're really out there to protect a writer from getting seriously hurt. And it's an enormous service, even when it can be pretty exhausting to go through the process. But, and I it's also being on the other end of the process also gives you, for me, having been on both sides of it, gives me some sympathy. I also have sympathy for writers because I've been fact checked. And I know that sometimes it can feel really onerous and maybe a little bit over the top. When I wrote a piece for Harper's, and the fact checker tried to correct me on my age. He asked me my birthday, and then he was like, well, doesn't that make you, 29 in 3 months or something like that? And I was like, okay, no, we're not making this change. But
Hey, what is the meaning of this? Well, I want to say that this episode is also brought to you by my monthly newsletter. Oh yeah, that's right. On the first of the month, you can get a tasty bit of goodness sent right to your inbox. My reading recommendations for the month and what you might have missed from the world of the podcast. Visit BrendanO'Mara.com. Once a month, no spam, can't beat it. Now back to the show.
yeah, that's a little too far. But in general, fact checking really it's a service. And usually the fact checker's name is not on the person's story. So, this is someone who's taken maybe like 20 hours, 30 hours of their week to make sure that every word of your story is true and their name isn't even on it. It's a pretty amazing kind of work. It's pretty selfless. And I have a huge amount of respect for fact checkers. And I think basically we're lucky to get fact checked. That's pretty much how I feel about it.
Yeah. And so if you're, when I was having a conversation with Bronwyn Dickey a while ago, she said one of the favorite talks she attended was with Lawrence Wright, and basically he brought out his backpack and unpacked everything, and basically this is all the stuff that he goes on a reporting trip with, whether that's in his backyard or elsewhere. And so what are some things that Naomi needs, and what's in your mailbag or your shoulder bag or your backpack that with all your reporting tools, what does that look like for you? What can't you live without?
Well, that's a good question. I'm pretty minimalist, Brendan.
Yeah.
I'm pretty minimalist. My I always carry a couple different sizes of notebooks. I've got a regular size notebook that I keep for writing, and then I also keep a tiny one in my back pocket just in case I ever need to write something down right then and there in the moment. That one's pretty tattered, but I hold on to it. So a couple different notebooks, good pens. I kind of care about using a good pen. I don't know. I think it makes me enjoy the process a little more. And yeah, my laptop, my phone, good set of headphones. I think that's about it. I'm not a terribly particular. I don't have a lot of particularity when it comes to what I carry in my bag, I guess.
Do you use a voice recorder at all for your interviewing?
Yeah, I always record my interviews. I first of all, I try to be really present and engaged in the conversation, and I find that I pretty much can't do that if I'm taking notes. There's no way some people have that ability, kind of like playing drums, to do two things at once. I can't take notes and really be closely engaged with the person. So that's one reason I record, and the other reason that I record is that, ironically, I think people worry about interview subjects getting freaked out by a recorder, but I actually think people are more distracted by you taking notes. Taking notes is kind of a constant reminder that you're being interviewed and that somebody's writing down everything you're saying. Whereas a recorder, it's on the table and then someone often usually forgets about it. So I find it less intrusive. So yeah, I always record my interviews. On the phone, I use Tape a Call, which is, I think, the best $10 I ever spend, or the best $10 I spend once a year is for Tape a Call. Yeah, I'm pretty simple about it.
Nice. It's funny. I don't dig into it enough, and I think I'm going to start digging into it more, like the interviewing with the recorder versus the notes. It's something I used to talk about a lot, and I've gotten away from it. Just I don't know why. I just have.
Yeah.
But my hero in narrative journalism is John McPhee, and yeah, he is a staunch sort of tape recorder denier. Just does not think. He actually thinks that's intrusive, and it actually, by virtue of it being unselective by the stuff it pulls in, that it doesn't allow you to be selective of the right details. I kind of disagree. I think it gives you the chance to be selective after the fact, but at least it's catching everything. And I like to hear people's approach to it. But it sounds like it's just, for you especially, it's a way to catch everything. It's a way to not be scrambling like crazy, taking notes for those quotes, and then you can get it right.
That's the other thing is, as a former research editor, I'm pretty serious about getting it right. And I don't necessarily think that notes are going to capture everything right down to every word. It leaves a little bit too much to guessing. But yeah, I couldn't possibly, I mean, you asked what kind of kid I was. It was the same way when I was in high school. Like, I was much better at listening in class if I was just listening than if I was also trying to write everything down. And I think I have a pretty good memory. I listen. I think I'm a pretty like attentive listener. And I like to do that with all of me when I'm talking to someone. If I'm trying to write things down while they're talking, I just think in general, when I'm interviewing someone, I try to have as natural a conversation as possible, right? Like, I'm trying to have a conversation as two humans. And of course, there's certain things I want to make sure that I get to, but I'm really trying to have a natural and organic conversation. And I can't do that if I'm taking notes. So I think different people have different methods that work for them. But for me, it's recording is really allows me to like just be present.
Yeah, and I've found too that if you're, I've tried to say, with this feature I'm writing, you know what, I'm going to put the recorder away and try to do it old school. And there's a part of me that really likes that, but I know if I'm really scrambling and scribbling notes and quotes down, inevitably when I go to transcribe those notes and there are gaps in what they say because I can't write down every word, you end up backfilling that with words that maybe I use versus the exact words they use, right? Is that something you experience?
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. And, it just limits you in terms of what kind of quotes you can use. Absolutely. And that's my worst nightmare. I never want to put words in somebody's mouth. So yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then again, if you're going to be fact checked, you're going to have to show those notes to a fact checker. And that's not fun, showing somebody your stuff. So yeah.
Do you transcribe them on your own?
Yeah, I pretty much always transcribe on my own. Occasionally, recently I've started using recently I've become aware of the usefulness of automated transcribers, but you can't use them for an actual transcript. What they're good for is, say, like, I just had this 3-hour interview. I'm not going to transcribe the whole thing. But if you put it through an AI transcriber, maybe that just sort of gives you a general like outline of what you talked about, and that becomes very easy to search for the parts that you need, and then you can transcribe those on your own. But yeah, I transcribe my own interviews, even though I find it to be an absolutely miserable process. I hate transcription so much, but it's the only way for me to do it for now.
It's the worst. But what I do find with recording, I know when I was reporting on my 6 Weeks in Saratoga's book I wrote almost 10 years ago, like having an interview with this one horse trainer on the backstretch of Saratoga, we were having a conversation. Then when I went back over the recording, it was just one of those days where you could hear all the birds in the background. And that just added like so much color and some little nice accents to the scene, like a blue jay screeching. And it just gave you this more pastoral feel of what was going on. And that's something I might not have caught if I was just taking notes because I'm trying to scribble down what Nick Zito was saying at every minute.
Yeah. That's absolutely true. Yeah. I mean, I'm a subscriber of the recording school for sure.
And with respect to your research and everything, once you've got all these notes, you've got transcripts, how do you go about organizing those notes and then you have access to them for when you're starting to sort of generate the piece you're looking to write?
Oh man, I'm so I'm very simplistic about this. This is just the process that works for me. I pretty much keep one story in one doc, and at the bottom part of the doc, I'll have like transcription, notes, stuff I want to include. If there's like particular quotes that I definitely want to make sure that I work into the piece, I'll highlight them in another color. And then I write the story in the top half of the doc. And it's what I find works for me, just to be able to easily go back and forth. And I use Command F, like search kind of religiously. It's just the easiest way to keep everything in one place. It's definitely not the most complex of systems. It's kind of analog, but it's what works for me.
And are you an advocate of outlines or cork boards, index cards as sort of a way to blueprint the piece you're writing?
Yeah, that's funny you should ask. I'm really I'm pretty bad about outlining. I'm not much of an outliner. I just kind of can't force myself to do it. Sometimes for more journalistic pieces, I will sort of chart out the path of a story for myself, like sort of jot down a very informal kind of rough sort of structure. Like this is the path I'm planning to follow to go from this point to this point to this point. And then I just kind of keep that at the top of the doc. It helps kind of keep me on track. For longer, more kind of creative nonfiction, memoir type work, sometimes I've found it helpful to chart it out kind of like on a big board or a wall using post-it notes, kind of more as a constellation of the story than anything. Like, for example, I was in Maine recently on a writing residency in Monson, Maine, and was working on this long essay about my uncle who died of AIDS when I was a kid, and the essay's memoiristic, and it's sort of about my relationship with him and the specter of him in my life, and his generation of gay folks and mine. And so it has a lot of different scenes and a lot of different moving parts and a lot of different ideas. And I ended up on the wall there in my studio in Maine, where I was for a month. I kind of charted out all these different scenes on Post-its and just had them arranged in sort of an orbit around the central questions of the essay. And eventually I actually pulled my chair right in front of that wall and would sit in front of it with my laptop on my lap, so that if I felt tempted to get lost, I could just look up from my computer and have right in front of me on the wall, like, Naomi, this is what you're doing. This is how all these ideas kind of relate or connect to each other. So I find it helpful in sort of an abstract way. But I'm definitely not a formal outliner at all. It's just not the way that my writing brain works.
You know, a lot of the writing process, of course, involves writing and looking through notes, but there's also a lot of value in just using a quiet time, silence, long walks, and thinking about what you're writing as part of the process. And I wonder how you incorporate just, quiet and thinking and sort of, lack of a better word, meditating on the work that is also very influential in what you end up sort of generating once you're ready to sit down at the computer.
Yeah, I do find that the space and time away from the work helps. And the times that it helps the most is when I'm really like stuck on something and I'm like, I just don't know how to solve this problem. And then I sort of feel chained to my computer in those moments. Like I can't walk away from it right now. I have to figure this out. But then it's usually when I walk away and I take a shower or I go for a walk or that then it's sort of some of the smoke clears and it feels more like I sort of figure it out. I'm a runner and I'm one of those people who, everybody says like, oh, they like work out their writing problems while they're running. And like, that happens for me too. But I would say that 90% of the time 90% of the time I do not remember what I figured out when I get back from my run. So I'm like out for a run and I'm like, oh, that's what I'm going to do with that transition. Or like, oh, that's how I should start that piece. And then I get back and I have no idea what I figured out while I was out there. So maybe it works its way through some subconscious part of my brain. I also have the thing that happens where I'll be like falling asleep at night and I'll be like, oh, that's exactly how I'm going to solve this problem in my writing. And I do usually try to write it down. But in the morning, very often I look at it and I'm like, this doesn't solve this problem at all. So, it's not necessarily the most reliable part of my brain, but yeah, I think it's most useful when I've sort of been struggling with something and then I take some space from it. And that's when some answers emerge.
Do you have any limiting beliefs or that sort of 3 a.m. voice that pops into your head that you have to sometimes wrestle with and fend off so you can confidently go back to the work?
Oh God, of course. Where do I start? Of course. Yeah, no, I'm constantly having to fight off that internal critic.
What does that critic tell you?
oh, either, some version of like, this is not original, or this is not interesting, or this doesn't track, or you're never going to be able to finish this. You can never publish this. I mean, it goes on and on. I think I'm really into Annie Dillard's book on writing. I think it's like kind of, I don't know, it's been an amazing companion for me. And she has this thing in it where she says that any extreme thoughts about your writing, either like the feeling that, oh my God, I'm writing the most brilliant thing ever and this is perfect and this is like my greatest work, or the opposite, like this is terrible, this will never get published, this is crap. Both of those thoughts are highly suspect and should basically be treated like a mosquito, just swatted away. And I think it's pretty wise. I think that's generally true. Anytime I've ever felt like, oh my God, Naomi, this is like the worst thing anyone's ever written, or when I'm like, wow, this is really great, this is really perfect, it's usually not coming from a reliable place, and I try to just ignore it.
I know exactly what you're saying, and I just of late, just the nature of the show, I read a lot of brilliant writers, and oftentimes I'm just like, right now I'm reading some collections of Chuck Klosterman essays, and I just got finished reading Jenny Odell's How to Do Nothing, and of course there's other people who, it's just, I read the stuff, I'm like, I'm just incapable of feeling like processing thoughts or having these kind of thoughts and then riffing on it in such a way that sometimes it can be kind of crippling when you start playing those kind of comparison Olympics. And are there writers of that nature where you're reading them, you're like, man, like I am just this little peon. How can I ever write something that pops like this?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes you read someone, and I don't remember who I was talking to recently who was saying this. Sometimes you read someone and you're like, well, I'll just hang up my hat. Like, why would I even bother trying?
Right.
I mean, that's how you feel. Sometimes you read someone who's really brilliant and you're like, what's the point? Like,
right.
Why am I even going to do this? But, like I've been really lucky that one of the main things I've done as an adult is be a teacher or trainer of some kind. And so and that's been such a privilege. And it's like, I have to tell myself the same thing that I've always told my students or folks I've mentored, which is like, there's always going to be people who are better than you. And there's also always going to be people who are worse than you. And that really can't be the reason that you write or don't write. It just really has nothing to do with it. Like there will always be somebody who's, and even more beyond that, like it's really not the point, right? I mean, we're not existing on a ladder where it's like this person's better, this person's worse. I think that kind of thinking is super toxic, and it's more about kind of just your work on its own. It's really not. Obviously, our work doesn't exist in a vacuum, but we're also not producing it to be on a platform next to other people's work and to be compared, because we're doing different things. We're different writers. We're working on different projects. And when I admire somebody's work, I try to, first of all, just appreciate it, and then think about, what I can learn from them. I think that's much more productive.
Great.
Obviously easier said than done, just to be clear.
Oh, for sure. Like there's this great Austin Kleon quote or something. He quoted someone in his book, Show Your Work. I'm trying to pull it up real quick right now on my Kindle. Don't be jealous when the people you like do well. Celebrate their victory as if it's your own. And that's like such a great way to channel sometimes the negative energy of those toxic feelings of jealousy and envy. That is a monster to be killed in this line of work.
Yeah, and we need each other. Like, my friends who are writers are, those are such important relationships. Like, those are the folks that, we have a drink or a cup of coffee, or we're hanging out by each other's desks and being like, oh man, this edit is really killing me, or like, oh God, this lead is really killing me, or like, oh, revision, or oh, writing. Like, that's like really beautiful. That's, that kind of solidarity is so crucial to surviving it and to keeping going. And I think that's what's valuable. I'm not saying that jealousy isn't like a really real thing to contend with, but it's not helpful, and it's really not the point,
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I, with respect to your with that great essay you wrote in the New York Times about getting the yips and working your way through that, which is of course the reason why we're in touch. I came across that essay somehow. I was at AWP here in Oregon,
Oh, cool.
and I don't know, it just popped up in my feed, and I was like, oh, this is awesome, and so, I read it, of course, reached out to you. So what was the genesis of this essay? And we'll talk about sort of your writing routine around it, but I'd love to start getting into this essay a little bit and how you came to it.
Yeah, that's a good question. Writing that essay was very cathartic for me. It was really because honestly, I didn't think that there was anything that could make me feel better about having that experience of totally losing my ability to throw a ball.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm not sure the writing made me feel better about losing the ability to throw the ball, but at least I got something out of it. So yeah, I think it was probably largely just a point of catharsis to start writing it. Just really like an attempt to grapple with and maybe to understand a little bit what had happened. And then, it became its own project on its own, which was like a piece of writing that I cared about and was kind of interested in completing. So,
have you ever experienced a writing version of the yips?
That's a great question. Definitely. I think, yeah. I mean, I'm not sure it counts as the yips, but certainly I think there's a psyching out that can happen on the page. And particularly starting a piece, especially I find the more expectations I have of it, or the more it matters to me, or the more I sort of like deeply invested in where it's going to go, or have a lot of ideas about what I want it to be, it can be really overwhelming to start. I mean, there's a reason that the whole blank page thing is a cliche. It's because it's really true. It's hard to face a blank page. I have a really terrible habit. I can't believe I'm going to admit this here, but I have a terrible habit of like starting the same piece like 5 times. And I mean, I literally have sort of, I'll write and rewrite the opening 5 different times, and they're not that different, but I kind of can't force myself to move on, which is, I think, that's sort of yipsy. And then of course the thing you have to do is to just force yourself to move on and to remind yourself that you will come back to it. But yeah, I definitely can psych myself out for sure in writing. I think.
Yeah. And for people who might be unfamiliar with the yips, it's kind of an inability to, it's like Chuck Knobloch is the best example that comes to mind of the former second baseman for the Yankees. On a 15-foot throw from second base to first base, he could not hit his target. He just could not do it anymore. How many times did Chuck Knobloch made a throw from second to first, and suddenly he couldn't do it anymore? And this is, similarly, there are some golfers who can't putt. They'll get up to the putt, and then there's a block, and they can't putt. They just can't pull the stroke anymore. So it's a great, the way you approach the essay is great, and it's just your way of working through it. How did working through it on the page help with, or not help with, your own, at least the physical manifestation of the yips?
Well, I haven't tried yet, so I have to let you know. I haven't tried to face that problem again yet. And it'll be interesting to see. One of the main suggestions that they give to people, or one of the main ways that people deal with the yips, is by changing something about what they do. I mean, in the most common example in baseball, people very often switch positions. Chuck Knobloch was eventually sent to left field. That's usually the thing that solves it for people. So I've been like, maybe I should start throwing left-handed. That's occurred to me, because right now I think I probably could throw better with my left hand than my right. But no, I have not tried to address it. And that's probably the most common question I've gotten since writing the piece. So
yeah,
I'll let you know when I do.
And so with your writing process, I'm always fascinated with daily rituals and daily routines. And is there a routine by which you adhere to every day, whether you write 1,000 words or 5,000 or 100? Is there something that you build into every day so you have some regularity to your creative schedule?
Yeah, my day varies a little bit because I'm a freelancer and I'm working on such different size projects. I have short pieces that are sort of journalistic, quicker hits, and then I have much longer, more creative projects, and I have meetings, and sometimes I have a deadline that I have to hit, and sometimes I have a revision. But in general, I try to go into my office most days. I'm really lucky that I have a desk at Type Media Center through my fellowship. And I think that makes a really big difference. I learned really early on in this process that I'm not someone who can work from home. I have no interest in working from home. It's just like not enough separation. I like being in a space where I'm like, I'm here to do work. I'm here to write. Physical space really affects me as a writer. I feel like I need to be in the right place. I'm really affected by auditory distraction. I can definitely not write in coffee shops, like music, people talking. I'm super easily distracted. So I go into my office at Type, which is right off Union Square. It's a really nice place to be. And I pretty much try to do as much writing as I can in the first half of the day and leave anything like revision or edits or administrative stuff for the later part of the day. I kind of think of my brain like a pool, and overnight it drains. And so when I wake up in the morning, it's empty. And it's kind of like the words that I need to write are written on the bottom of the pool. And so in the earlier part of the day, I can see them pretty clearly, but as the day goes on, everything that happens in my day is kind of like water filling up the pool. And so by mid afternoon or late afternoon, it's like really hard to see through all that water to what's written on the floor. So I try to kind of get as much writing done in the first part of the day as I can before the pool is filled up and I'm kind of like my brain's more muddled. And then in the second part of the day, deal with email and some revisions, and I find that it really varies. Like sometimes if I'm sort of in the right place and I'm really excited about what I'm working on, I might be able to write for a whole lot of hours and get a whole lot done. And then there are the days that we all have where I spend all day and, I have 250 words to show for it. And I think they're pretty crappy 250 words too. And, who can say why that happens? Other than that, the best thing to do is to just try again tomorrow. I think, a couple of the pieces of advice that have helped me, and I think they're all pretty obvious and pretty common, but they work for me. Like one is, as much as I can, just try to keep coming back to it every day, whether or not it's good. I had a writing mentor once who said you have to write through the bad to get to the good. And I think that's really true. So it's a process. So even if I feel like what I'm producing in a particular day is bad, that's not an excuse to just like leave it, because I sometimes really need to write through those difficult and bad moments to get to the better work. And the more that I can do it every day as a practice, the less sort of overwhelming or intimidating it is when I come back to it the next day, because it's just the same thing I did the day before and the day before that. And it becomes something that I'm used to and familiar, and it's not as overwhelming. And then the other thing, and this is like such a basic piece of advice, I think it probably came from Hemingway, is just to like, actually, Brendan, don't let's not attribute this to Hemingway because I don't know if it comes from him or not, and I don't want to give him credit for something he doesn't deserve. But the other piece of advice that I find really useful is I try to, when I stop for the day, I try to stop somewhere where I know what I'm going to do next.
Yeah, that is Hemingway. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. It's Hemingway. And I find that useful, and it can be actually difficult advice to follow because if you know what's happening next, you want to keep going, right? Like you want to keep going until you're really stuck. But I think I find that useful because then the next day I really do, it's like that much easier to pick it up again.
And what are some books you find yourself rereading to kind of remind yourself how it's done and to inspire you to kind of make the best of your own work?
Yeah, I mean, On Writing by Annie Dillard is probably my favorite text on writing. I think she has so many it's just sort of it's really just the whole book is just sort of a meditation on being a writer and the writing process, on the rituals of it, on the weird rhythms of it, on the feeling of it, on the practices of it. I love how much she thinks about both the mundane, like sort of, the view out the window and the coffee that you drink. And then also, sort of the bigger ideas. Something that she writes about that I've spent a lot of time thinking about lately is, she talks about writing as an epistemological tool. And so writing is kind of that we write to figure out what we don't already know. We write to learn about something and to actually explore our own ideas and thinking about something. And I think that's a really good charge. And it's also difficult to do. I find that with my own writing, the internet, publishing on the internet really has an appetite for pieces that are kind of articulating something that we already believe quite strongly. So, everybody loves to read and to retweet an essay that's sort of like, here's this really strong feeling or belief I have about something. And I've written it really beautifully and really eloquently and really articulately. And the person gets to the end of the essay and they're kind of like, yeah, I really agree with that, and they're kind of like, fuck yeah. Like, and they like retweet it. Like, I kind of think it's like the fuck yeah essay. And that's great. Like those, and I think I've written some of those pieces. But when I think about myself as a reader, the pieces that really stay with me and that I really love are not the pieces that I finish and I'm just like, yeah, I really agree with that. And probably I already agreed with the person before they wrote it too, or before I read it too. The pieces that I really love and value and appreciate the most are the pieces that kind of at the end of them, I'm like, huh, and I'm kind of, it makes me think, right? And those are the pieces that I tend to still be thinking about days later. They're complicated. They don't have pat conclusions. They're not easy or simple. They don't necessarily, they're not summed up in a single sentence. But I think they're more, more rigorous and more, and the thing is, they're not just more challenging, intellectually challenging for the reader. They're also more challenging for the writer. And so I'm trying to do more work like that these days. Like that's sort of my challenge to myself, is to reach less for the pieces that are sort of, that I already have figured out before I write them. It's tempting to want to write something where I already know how I feel about this. It's much more scary and intimidating and overwhelming to think about writing something where I'm not sure what I think about it, and it's kind of complicated and it's difficult to figure out. And it's intimidating because it means I could get it wrong. And, I could publish something and then somebody could write to me and say, I think you got this super, super wrong. And that's scary, but I think it's much more intellectually honest and more rigorous. So I'm trying to do more of that. And to come back to Annie Dillard, I feel like she really encourages that. She has this beautiful quote in that book that I'm going to mess up, but I had it on the wall of my studio in Monson when I was at my writing residency. And it says, she writes, the new place interests you because it is unfamiliar, you attend. And it's all about this idea of like, we go in our writing to places that we don't already have figured out, that we don't already know. And we kind of poke around in there and try to figure out what we can learn. She talks about she has all these beautiful metaphors. She talks about the pen as she gives this image of the writer sort of walking around a house and tapping very gently on the wall, looking for studs. And that writing is kind of like that. Like you're tapping around in the dark, sort of figuring out, is this, what do I think about this? Like, where does this idea take me? If I follow this thought, where does it lead? And that's scary because it might lead you somewhere that you didn't expect. Or what if you get lost in the house and you can't find your way out? But, again, I think that's ultimately more rewarding. And for me as a writer, I guess has more integrity than writing the piece where I already have the blueprint of the house in my mind. And it's just a question of writing it down,
So, of course, you were a creative writing major in undergrad, and you've kind of graduated more towards nonfiction and journalistic stuff with your fellowship with Type Media. So where do you see your writing going in the next 5 to 10 years?
Oh boy. Big questions. Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm really interested in this space of creative nonfiction that is both really highly concerned craft, with good writing, with writing as an art, but that's also firmly sort of engaged with the world. And I think that's sort of like a difficult line to walk, but those are the writers who I tend to really admire the most. A lot of them are, it's interesting, a lot of them are fiction writers who have become nonfiction writers, which I think is interesting. So I think they kind of bring the kind of fiction sensibility in terms of storytelling, in terms of craft, but they're also writing work that's engaged with the world in some way, that's grounded in the real world. Which is not to say that fiction isn't also grounded in the real world in a different way. I think I should probably try to tackle longer and longer work. That's something that I'm sort of have on the horizon for me. But I have a YA novel that on the shelf sometimes gets taken down off the shelf. It's kind of the YA novel that I would have wanted to read when I was a queer teenager. That's always there in the background, sort of in progress.
Yeah, you got to write that for sure. You know,
Yeah,
you got to. Yeah, like you're writing for that person, or writing the thing that you wish you had when you were little is a great creative kick in the ass. It really is.
Yeah. And writing YA is a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun because teenagers they're basically the most, raw, essential versions of ourselves. They're just like us. They're just without all the filters and the baggage and the ego. And not to say they don't also have egos, but they're without all the like crap that we've accumulated to kind of like put between us and the world. And they feel feelings so deeply. And so, yeah, writing about New York City in the early 2000s through the eyes of a queer teenager, it's a lot of fun. It's one of my more fun writing projects. So yeah.
Cool. So Naomi, where can people find you online and get more familiar with your work?
You can follow me on Twitter. It's NaomiGloebl. Pretty much my name, Naomi G. Loebl. It's probably the best way to find me right now. And I also have a page on Type Media's website too.
Fantastic. Well, Naomi, thank you so much for carving out the time to talk about your work and the yips and everything. This was a lot of fun getting to know you on the conversation on the show here, and I deeply look forward to the time we can do this again down the road.
Yeah, it was great to chat with you, Brendan. Thank you so much. It's fun to talk with you about writing and everything else.
Still have to use my morning indoor voice as we record this outro. All right. Good times had by all, right? That was fun, wasn't it? But let me tell you, man, tired, fried. I can barely keep my eyes open. No complaining, though. Gotta soldier on. Can't complain. Can't be doing that. Thanks to Goucher's MFA in Nonfiction and Baypath's MFA in Creative Nonfiction for the support. It's always fun to have that support, and the show is made possible by those patrons, and of course, you guys for listening. Be sure to subscribe to the show and keep the conversation going on Twitter by tagging the show at CNFpod. You may also tag me at Brendan O'Mara. Digital fist bumps and devil horns abound. If you have a spare 2 to 5 minutes, consider leaving a review leaving a review of the show on Apple Podcasts and link up to the show on social media. Helps with the packaging of the show and just makes me feel damn good. I think that's it. My head is about to hit the keyboard, so remember, if you can't do indoor voice interview, see ya.